We're so pleased to have him with us today for another mini session. Again, the title for this mini session is the Unilateral Impulse, the Quad, and Non-Proliferation. So again, we'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Raymond Kuo, Director and Senior Political Scientist at RAND. Raymond.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Get that out of the way just in case. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. I always love appearing from Global Minnesota. It's a wonderful organization. I'm actually going to come back to that at the very end. So today's discussion is on the unilateral impulse, and hopefully it can put into context what we're seeing, our discussions today about India and the subcontinent within those kind of wider regional and possibly global architecture and dynamics that we're seeing. So first, I'm going to discuss the choice sets of small states and the assumptions that we see often in the Trump administration about how, other states just have to accept what we're going to give them, and that's not actually true, and that's problematic assumption within unilateralism, this unilateral approach to foreign relations. Wait, is this the? Cool. Hang on a second. Yeah, I'm not sure this is the okay. That doesn't matter. I'll figure it out. And then I'll kind of tie in the Quad and nuclear proliferation discussions at the very end. So the main takeaways here are that this unilateral impulse we see in the Trumpian foreign policy is based on a fairly shaky assumption. Unfortunately, the implication of this is that the Quad is not going to be that effective at structuring Indo-Pacific relations going forward, and also that we could be facing a future where there is more nuclear proliferation. And while there are theories out there that suggest that no, this is actually a pretty good thing, everybody having nukes will lead to a more peaceful world, there are really strong reasons for us to think that we probably shouldn't do that. So I want to start with tariffs. We all have seen this picture. And Trump is pushing for tariffs despite the fact that the market very clearly told him, like, this is a really bad idea. I don't remember what day I took the shot, but it's kind of kept going down, down, down. So Trump doesn't seem to care. Let me see if this works. Oh, shoot, I don't think it did. Okay. And he says that, look, I'm telling you, these countries are calling up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, this is his sir story. Whenever he says the word sir, he's lying and didn't actually happen. I'll do anything, sir, right? So despite the signals that the market's sending, he doesn't seem to care. And in fact, he goes further and says that we do this.
I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up. Yes, they are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything, sir.
He goes further, right? It's not just that other countries will do what we say, but he says, let's see if this works. Did it work?
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to make a deal. And if they don't want to make a deal, we'll make the deal for them. Because that's what's going to happen. We'll just say, this is what it is. But
so it's not just that people have to come crawling to us, but it's that we can actually enforce it. They have no better choice. We're America, bitch. You got like this kind of juvenile sense of not just unilateralism, but humiliation and dominance play that often comes into this type of foreign policy, or at least this foreign policy approach. And so it actually has echoes of another approach called restraint. And I'm a little bit of danger here. The restrainers have good, solid reasons for why they make this argument, but and I don't want to sane wash what Trump is actually saying or doing, but I do want to say that there is a larger point here that the U.S. can pull back from international engagements, and it will be okay because other countries ultimately don't have many other choices. But so if we define U.S. interests narrowly to focus on security and prosperity, we can shift tools away from military more towards diplomacy, and we'll reduce our military size, cost, deployments, commitments. We'll continue to have economic dominance within the international global economic system, and ultimately our nuclear shield is what protects us from any kind of downside risk. If the world goes to crap, we still have our nuclear weapons, and nobody's going to want to attack us, or really any other nuclear power. In fact, when we think about, say, foreign security engagements, there was a recent piece by a former colleague of mine, Jennifer Kavanaugh, and Stephen Wertheim saying, look, the U.S. can actually just pull back from commitments to Taiwan. Yeah, sure, we'll send them weapons, they'll defend themselves. We can pull back from commitments to Taiwan. And even if the Chinese take it over, the only impact that's going to have is that Japan and South Korea cozy up even further to us. We win-win out of all of this. We can abandon that. No, I just said all this. Yeah, we can divest ourselves of an unwinnable conflict and prioritize our true interests with relatively little blowback. On economics, same sort of thing. The argument here is that countries care more about their domestic economies than they do trade. It's actually not entirely true, but it's an assumption there. In addition, other countries will not retaliate against us because one, we are one of perhaps two dominant global economies. On top, we are the reserve currency. And imposing tariffs are inefficient, so ultimately countries will not do so. And then because we are, the dominant economy in the globe, we can simply capture important parts of that economy to ensure our long-term kind of primacy in that field. But is that true? Is it true that these other states don't have many options? Well, we can actually look at foreign responses to the tariffs to get a sense of, well, okay, how effective are they? Well, not great. The other countries, the EU, can retaliate. Yeah, oh, good. The Canadians are boycotting. What used to be here was American whiskey. There's been a widespread boycotting of American products in Canada. It's not just the European Union that's has imposed retaliatory tariffs, so too has China. So against, the EU is imposing tariffs against its main security partner. The Chinese are imposing tariffs against their main trading partner. Obviously boycotting and also efforts at diversion or diversification or exclusion. For one of the first times, the Japanese, South Korean, and Chinese foreign ministers met up to discuss economic cooperation in a way that does not include the United States. And it's all in response to these tariffs. So other countries have many, many other options when it comes to how do you want to, can they push back against US efforts, and how can they, in some cases hurt us? And on top of that, we suffer from a credibility deficit. Now, let's say somehow in the next, I think he's got 80 more days, maybe 79 more days, the Trump administration negotiates 75 free trade agreements, which is what he says it's going to do. First off, trade agreements are really, really complex. They take years, if not decades, to actually write because what you're doing is aligning your internal bureaucracies and regulatory structures to allow for free trade. That means that you have to go against a whole bunch of entrenched political interests in your own country, and you can do it across multiple countries. It makes it really difficult. On top of that, even after you sign the agreement, the issue right now is that Trump, when he talks about imposing tariffs on Canada and Mexico and saying we got a raw trade deal, he's talking about the trade deal he signed 6 years ago. So there's a huge credibility issue. You sign a trade deal with the United States, you think you've made a good deal. And if he wakes up in a bad mood and 6 years later, he'll just decide, you know what? No, I don't care about that trade deal. We're going to renegotiate it all over again. What country, what business wants to create or invest in the United States, given that type of tariff and regulatory environment? So ultimately, countries, smaller states have a bunch of other choices, as Tom Long explains in his book. It's a great book, I think published 1 or 2 years ago. And the problem here is that for many unilateralists or restrainers, the assumption here is that costs simply disappear by defining our interests narrowly. If we just say, look, we don't care about the rest of the world, we don't care about our global economic leadership, well, that just means we don't pay the cost for that leadership anymore. That's great. And yet somehow the benefits of those costs still remain by some sort of magic. Exactly. So I want to paraphrase, the great Michael Scott from The Office here, who says, I do want all of the credit and none of the blame. Somehow we have this magical outcome where we don't pay anything for international leadership because we're pulling back, and we still get all the benefits of that leadership in some magical process. And I had notes here, but so let's talk a bit about that. The United States, post-World War II, established a whole bunch of different international institutions, including IMF, World Bank, the United Nations, NATO, OSCE, and all of these organizations help to embed our power. When I teach this kind of, or when I used to teach this issue, the whole Spider-Man quote, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Well, in international relations, it's kind of not quite that. With great power comes great liability. Post-World War II, the United States was strong enough to defeat every single country in the world at the same time. Well, because we had nuclear weapons, and no one else did. But when it came time to say, we want to create a new order, we want to create new economic arrangements, security arrangements that do better than what we had in the past, US power becomes a liability, because ultimately, I could make an agreement with you, but how do you know I'm going to stick to it? What's going to prevent me from waking up 2 days later and say, you know what, I actually don't want to do that anymore, and you can't stop me? Because ultimately they couldn't. It's why we have all these institutions. These institutions embed American power and say to other states, look, all these institutions have rules. We will follow these rules. We will join these institutions, and you have one, you will see that we regularize our foreign policy. So you have some understanding of where we're going to go and what we're going to do. On top of that, by joining these organizations and following their rules, you will have input into the American foreign policy making process. Through these institutions, we will listen to you. We may not always agree, we may not, do what you want, but at least you have a venue for and mechanisms for settling disputes with the United States and understanding where our foreign policy is going to go. These are not, costless memberships, but they are not expensive either, especially given the amount of benefits that the United States gets from it. So because of our international leadership, we have less international conflict, we have more influence over partners and allies, increased trade, but oftentimes the retort I often hear from people is like, well, what do all these things actually do for me personally? So I'm going to highlight two things. One, dollar as a reserve currency means that our mortgage rates are much, much lower. My wife is from Bangladesh. What is the interest rate on a savings account in Bangladesh? Well, first off, what is the interest rate on a savings, just a regular commercial bank savings account for you guys here? Yeah, it's like a whole string of zeros and like a little one at the very end, right? What is in Bangladesh?
6 to 8%.
6 to 8%, right? Now think about that. That means if I put in $100, I get $6 or $8 at the end of the year. What does that do for your mortgage rate? A mortgage loan is a riskier investment. So if I'm going to incentivize that investment, I need to actually increase the mortgage rate, the mortgage rate to higher than 6 to 8%, which increases your costs. Now, granted, a friend of mine is trying to buy an apartment. The mortgage rate in the United States is like 7%. That's not great. Prior to this, however, we were looking at rates about 3 to 4% on average, sometimes even lower. That is a direct result of the dollar being a reserve currency, and that's money in your pocket from that. Also, visa-free travel. When my wife, as mentioned, she's from Bangladesh, we traveled to Turkey, and we had to go. I was living in DC at the time, and so I took her passport and ran it to the Turkish embassy. It took ages to get done, and she was really upset because she's without her Bangladeshi passport while she's running around and doing things. And we finally land in Istanbul, and there's a small booth there, and she's like, okay, good, it's your turn. Your turn to get a visa. Take your time. Enjoy this process. I want to see you suffer on this just like I have. So I walk up there, and like one visa, like $20, and like slap down a 20, like, they slap on the stamp, and it takes like 10 seconds. And my wife's like, I hate you. But that is one benefit of American leadership. We get to go to more countries. The US passport is like a gold card, essentially. We get to go to more countries than I think any other country in the world, essentially for free. As long as we show up and have valid documents, we can go right in for however long. So those are clear, concrete benefits that we get from American leadership. The problem is, of course, that the transactional unilateralist approach to foreign policy that we see within the Trump administration threatens a lot of that. It suggests that international institutions like the Quad really don't matter. They're just a burden, and we can unleash ourselves from them. It suggests that, well, when it comes to nuclear weapons or conflict more generally, it's just not our problem. And so other people need to be responsible for their problems. And I think this is critical. Those problems will not spill back onto us. So let's see if that's correct. So starting off with the Quad here. What is the Quad? It's these four countries: United States, Japan, India, Australia. It was actually established in the aftermath of the 2004 Asian tsunami, which killed almost 250,000 people. And established by this guy, the late Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan, who wanted to have an Asian arc of democracies. He wanted to gather a whole these four different countries here to address, not necessarily military, but security threats that affected these four countries in common, the strongest democracies in that region. And now the Chinese hated this, right? They called this a Cold War relic. They called it Cold War thinking. And the problem is, the reason why these countries wanted to get together was in part a response to Chinese, I wouldn't say, well, let's say assertiveness. You had border conflicts with India. You had maritime clashes with the Japanese. You had tariffs and boycotts of Australian beef and wine. And so China did itself no favors with this kind of wolf warrior foreign policy. I've never seen this movie, but the movie looks awesome. It's called Wolf Warrior 1 or 2. I can't remember, but it looks great. And the lack of internet or regional security institutions really charged up a lot of these kind of Quad concerns. You have a rising Chinese military. Now, granted, the rising military keeps pace with its rising economy. But the difficulty is that, yes, maybe China, maybe Beijing needs those weapons. It just needs them to feel safe. But in the absence of some kind of institution where the Chinese can talk to the Japanese, the Australians, and reassure them about what's going on, what they're doing, those countries will naturally get together and form their own institutions in order to hedge against the possibility of a future conflict with the Chinese. And so the goals for this organization were ultimately promoting a free and rules-based Indo-Pacific region, common rules governing interstate reactions in the Indo-Pacific region. That was the goal. And what does the Quad do? Mostly security dialogue. It's had, I think, 2 maybe joint military exercises so far, and it's economic coordination, like having a stockpile of rare earths to hedge against Chinese embargoes of those products. Its limitations: it's not an alliance, it's not a trade agreement. Oh, I think I missed something here. Yeah, okay. And I think more problematically are two pieces. One, it's Abe founded this explicitly on regime type, that it was an Asian arc of democracies. But as we're seeing, we have at least 2 of the 4 members who are turning their back on democracy, or thinking of democracy as not necessarily a value that brings cohesion to international engagements, military, security, or economic engagements. And so, there's a hollowing out of the Quad that's going on. On top of that, the Quad was never all that institutionalized. There were meetings amongst the principals, but that isn't necessarily like the presidents and prime ministers, but it wasn't necessarily reflective of reflected in lower level engagements. And I put up this picture here from Trump's previous term, because there was a lot of concern that, for example, NATO, that the US would withdraw from NATO. But one of the reasons why that didn't happen is because NATO was heavily institutionalized. It wasn't just the principals all meeting together and yelling at the United States. Instead, foreign ministers, defense ministers, and their subordinates 2-3 levels down in the echelon were also meeting on a fairly regular basis. I think the NATO process is foreign ministry staff meets on Tuesdays and defense ministry staff meets on Fridays. So you had this regular contact, and that institutionalization bridged NATO through the kind of difficult years of the first Trump administration. We'll see if it lasts for the second one. But on top of that, the Quad has even less institutionalization, has even less of those contact points, which means that it's going to be less and less relevant. And so, unfortunately, my expectation is that you're not going to be hearing very much from the Quad. What you're really going to be seeing is bilateral engagements between, say, the United States and India, or between, say, India and Japan, but you're not necessarily going to have this kind of cohesive network of four countries coming together for a common purpose. So that's a quad, kind of pessimistic. The other one is nuclear nonproliferation. And so a friend of mine, Alex Lasha, he published this book in 2016, 2018, somewhere around there, which makes the argument that the United States security commitments, alliances help to reduce nuclear proliferation. Because if the US says, hey, don't worry, you don't need to get your own nukes. We will extend our nuclear umbrella over you, and we will back it up with conventional deterrent. That's how you know we will actually be there. It reduces the desire by other countries to want to get their own nuclear weapons. If, however, we think about the converse of that, if the United States is pulling back from those alliances, then these other countries have an incentive to want to develop their own nukes. Obviously, India and Pakistan both have their own nuclear weapons already. You know, stuff coming up today suggests that we are on the pathway to possibly a war, but I want to paint an even worse picture somehow. A survey of Koreans. Oh, this is 2021. There was one more recently done last year, where 71% of South Koreans said, yeah, we should have our own independent nuclear deterrent, even if the United States keeps the defense treaty with South Korea, in part because they're not sure the United States is going to show up. And so 71% of South Koreans say we should have our own independent nuclear weapons. Japanese public opinion. This is from 2017, but it's fairly similar. Their trust overall in the United States has decreased. And as a result of that, even the only country that's been struck with nuclear weapons, people there are saying, yep, you know, it's going to happen. And the only question is when it does and how ready we are to like manage that process. And so, look, some people out there think that nuclear proliferation is not that big of a deal. Kenneth Waltz, who is probably the second or third most prominent international relations scholar of the last 50, 70 years, said, like, look, it's all fine. Nuclear weapons are ultimately defensive weapons. You don't use them because if you were to bomb another country and try to invade them, well, you've just irradiated the country that you want to invade. You also don't, they're only really useful as a defensive weapon. If someone strikes you, you always have massive retaliation against them. And so they ultimately will not strike you. Hang on a second. Oh, okay. But there are a couple problems with this. One, there's a possibility of accidents, right? That accidents that can trigger a nuclear conflict. So in 1962, we, the United States, dropped 4 nuclear bombs on Spain. We didn't do it intentionally. There was a refueling accident for a B-52 bomber, and the boom struck the plane. The plane went down, and 4 nuclear bombs were released. One of them detonated. Well, the casing around it detonated. And so we have, I think, 6,000 barrels, about 5.5 acres of Spanish soil sitting in a bunker somewhere in South Carolina right now. You could just imagine if one of those actually kicked off and blew up. Would any actor, if Spain somehow had nuclear weapons, would they think they had just been bombed? Who would they strike against? On top of that, there's the man who saved the world, Stanislav, I believe his last name is, Soviet nuclear controller, who said he took a look at some of the images and he said, like, yeah, his subordinates sent him an image saying, look, this is a US first strike. We have clear evidence from our satellites or detection platforms that the US is launching a nuclear weapon as right now. We need to send this up the chain and fire it back. But this guy also realized, he was an engineer. He's like, wait, no, the satellites have just been calibrated. And it seems unlikely that this would be a first strike because only one ICBM would seem to have been launched. And it turned out it was just sunlight reflecting off of clouds. But it had not been for that one guy in the loop saying, this is not quite right. This doesn't seem right. The US and the USSR could very easily have gone into a conflict. Now imagine a world where every country in the world has nuclear weapons, and these kinds of accidents start to, pile upon themselves, and you could easily kick yourself into a nuclear conflict of some kind or another. There's also the stability-instability paradox. I previously said that nuclear weapons are defensive weapons. You're not going to strike me because you know if you do, I will strike you back. And if both sides have nuclear weapons, we are in a position, a status of mutually assured destruction. And as a result of that, we're not going to fight each other. We're not going to send nukes at each other. But wait a minute. You're not going to send nukes at me because you know I have nukes. Okay. So what's to stop me? And maybe I'm not going to nuke you. But what's to stop me from punching you below the belt as much as I can to hurt you? The classic example of this being the Vietnam War, as well as Afghanistan and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We're not going to attack each other with nuclear weapons. We're going to make you bleed for it. And so you could easily see here as well how there are fewer controls on conflict in a nuclear proliferated world. The unilateralism of the current foreign policy we see means that we in the United States essentially don't care that there's more conflict. It's somebody else's problem. These conflicts will likely spill over into the United States, and then it becomes our problem. But ultimately, we're going to see more and more uncontrolled conflict in the international system. But ultimately, it all comes back to whether or not the United States wants to back up its nuclear nonproliferation with its military partnerships and alliances. And that's a big question right now. So, yeah, ultimately, with this unilateral impulse, we're going to see a loss of economic benefit. I mean, we've seen, I feel so sorry for everybody's 401ks. We've already seen a loss of economic benefits, less influence over allies and partners, and we have greater global conflict as a result. And I think the point I want to end on here is that this kind of pessimistic view actually reinforces the need for organizations like Global Minnesota and conferences just like this, because it ultimately comes from an initial assumption I mentioned, this belief, this easy assumption that other countries do not have agency, they do not have choices, so we can just ignore them and reap all the benefits while paying out the cost. Obviously, that's not true. And it also means that we need to have a better understanding of these other countries, of having the area expertise, having languages, people who can speak the language, working with diasporas. And I think that's the kind of the benefit of conferences like this, where we can better understand other countries and hopefully have better foreign policies as a result. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions. I forgot to bring my watch, so if I don't know how much time we have actually. Oh, okay. Sure.
Thank you. So one of the work that I did with the government was on CORD a bit. The thing that I was looking at is they had CORD leaders working group at the leaders level. There were approximately, I think, 6 tracks that they were looking at: climate, emerging tech, space is what we were looking at specifically. So how do you see that evolving with the changing priorities of the US administration?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think especially Department of Defense, to some extent the State Department, are really interested in emerging technology. This would be cyber capabilities, space capabilities. I'm forgetting one. Cyberspace. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So it wouldn't surprise me if there is cooperation on these particular issues. I think the difficulty is a couple-fold. One, there are ITAR regulations, international trade in arms regulations, something like that. I can never remember the acronym. That makes it more difficult for the United States to engage with other countries on these sort of technical matters. The other, I think, however, is, lining up. Is it in the US's interest to cooperate on space with, say, India or Japan? Couldn't we just do it ourselves? Why do we need to be giving our technology away to other people? Or if we are going to be working with others, how do we ensure that they won't misuse that technology, or use the technology in a way that we actually want it to be used? I mean, I think with space, it's relatively easier in that it's mostly about intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's not about putting weapons up in space. So it's a little bit easier to, when we're talking about, okay, we just want to have common domain awareness. Cool. That makes it much easier. But even then, there are questions about classification security. When I think about Taiwan, which is the kind of the topic I tend to cover the most, one of the reasons why, one of the drawbacks with Taiwan is that the US doesn't often share intelligence with them because they worry that if any intel we send to you will automatically go over to the Chinese. A similar sort of dynamic, I think, does occur outside the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are us, England, Australia, New Zealand. Who's the last one? Canada, of course, yeah. That's starting to change, but I think the question right now is, if you are one of the Five Eyes partners, and I'll be honest with there, you have the director of national intelligence who you might suspect of not exactly being on the up and up. Do you provide your information to the United States? I don't know. In the back.
Yeah, Raymond, about your question, I mean, your thing about, nuclear war, people will not fight because, the mutual destruction. That is not what has come out from Asia in the last, since World War II, in the Maoist years, you had him say, I'm ready to lose half my population in a fight against imperialists. And in the Kargil war in India, the Indians were willing, both sides of nuclear weapons, they were willing to take 3 times more attacks on India if they can get greater relative damage. Clinton had to invite Nawaz Sharif during the Kargil, and he had to put up a strong face and dissuade him from the nuclear option before the Kargil conflict. And the same way, the Islamists in the Middle East are also not averse to taking any risks of that. So they have, countries in Asia have this notion of self-image, and they're willing to take great risks. They have epic histories, and they're willing to take great risks against mortal enemies. Now, this seems like more with the Soviet Union, you have a rational a rational way of talking about nuclear weapons and foreign policy. Doesn't that in Asia, particularly with growing Asia, should you not be questioning that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one of the issues, so we can, it's a fair point. We definitely do get conflict between nuclear armed powers. But I think the question is, when it comes to stability instability paradox, we haven't seen nuclear exchanges specifically. There is conflict, but there's an attempt to use proxies in a lot of cases to have kind of deniability. But one of the major issues, or I think the key points here is that even if a war breaks out, what stops it from going nuclear? Does anybody actually want to go nuclear? And where is that red line? So I don't know the Kargil War all that well, unfortunately, but it struck me that nothing in that situation was an existential threat to either Pakistan or India. Had you gotten to an existential threat, do we think that they would have used nuclear weapons? Possibly. And so, one of the issues that I didn't mention here in terms of the nuclear shield that the United States has is that during the Eisenhower administration, we had a doctrine of massive retaliation, that if anyone messed with us, we would massively retaliate with our nuclear weapons. And the problem is, for other countries, you're like, okay, yeah, let's see if you actually are going to do that. You're going to take, if I take a small inch of your territory somewhere. I'm Canada, right? And one of my Canadians steps over the border and says, this is now part of Canada. Are you really going to nuke Ottawa? Are you really going to nuke Toronto? Okay, well, if I'm in Vietnam and I'm the USSR, I'm saying, hey, look, I'm going to support the people you don't like. You're going to nuke Moscow over that? Hanoi? No. And that's one of the issues. It's you set this red line, the salami slicing exercise occurs. And the problem is we don't know where the actual red line is. So one, massive retaliation tends not to work. Part of the reason it doesn't work is that we ultimately don't know where that red line is, and that's where the accidents occur. That's where the kind of nuclear kickoff that we just don't know occurs. And you make a good point about rationality. I will say that actually my friend Alex and a couple others wrote a piece about World War I on the European side of the conflict and said, look, honor, prestige, status, those kept the conflicts going, that World War I going much longer than it probably should have. I don't think that Asian cultures have a monopoly on honor calculations. I also don't think that Western countries have a monopoly on rationality whatsoever. I mean, and so as a result, when I again used to teach this, I would tell my students at the end of the lecture on nuclear weapons, it's a miracle every day when you wake up because you haven't died in a nuclear ball of fire. But if we see more nuclear proliferation as a way of shirking U.S. leadership, those chances go up.
Also, oh, there we go. Yeah, okay, let's give it a round of applause. Thank you. Well done.